Investigating the effectiveness of reflective journaling with reading intervention groups. When I did my literature review, I focused in on 3 areas: at-risk readers, the subject of the study, reading interventions in a broad sense, and then I narrowed in on reflective journaling, which is the intervention being implemented with the groups in this study. So for at-risk readers, I pulled some of the key points from some of those articles. 5 to 10% of children are estimated to be at risk for having serious reading problems that will affect them negatively later in life. These at-risk readers may never catch up to their grade level peers. According to the U.S. Department of Education, the Institute of Educational Sciences, and the National Center for Educational Statistics, if the students are still struggling by grade 3, they are 4 times more likely to be high school dropouts. So, detecting these struggling readers early on and implementing research-based reading interventions is the best way to catch those misconceptions before the students reach that point of failure. Looking at reading interventions in a more broad sense and what makes them most effective. A study by Wagner followed 3 struggling readers throughout a school year to compare different types of interventions and their response to those models. And that study concluded that different methods work best for each individual student. The study encouraged individualized intervention methods, which is something that reflective journaling allowed me to do with my treatment group. I was able to tailor their interventions based on misconceptions I saw in their individualized. Another study that I looked at followed students who were receiving stagnant interventions and changing interventions. So one group received a changing intervention that was adjusted by the teacher based on the students' misconceptions, based on areas that they succeeded in. She adjusted the intervention accordingly. And then the other group received a stagnant intervention that followed the prescription from start to finish without any adjustments based on student reactions to those interventions. And they found that the group receiving the changing intervention outperformed the stagnant group, which is something that I was able to do with my reading intervention journals. Those reflective journals allowed me to look at more in depth at what that group had misconceptions in or what that group succeeded in this week. And I was able to adjust their interventions a little more than I was able to adjust the group that wasn't having those reflective conversations or that writing that reflective journal piece. And then a third study followed kindergarten students. One group was receiving a teacher-led intervention where the teacher created the intervention herself based on the whole group material, slowing it down, more in depth. And then the other group was receiving a name brand Pearson and Scott intervention that was purchased by the school. And based on the results of that study, neither group made enough progress over the other to encourage the use of the purchased intervention over the teacher intervention. So my point of following that study was a careful examination of reading interventions to decide what is most effective for your students is the most important thing we can do, which is why I wanted to hone in on reading interventions and different strategies to make those more effective. And then the final area that I looked at in my literature review was reflective journaling, which is the actual intervention being implemented with my groups. So the first study that I followed general psychology students at West Point, and they used reflective journaling throughout a course, and it was included in their homework. It was a starting point for the class, so they reflected, they used it as assignments, they used it as discussions, and it was used as an assessment. So it was used throughout the course in a varying amount of ways. And the finding of that study was that the students in the group receiving the reflective journaling had a positive increase in their self-awareness, which is something I'm looking for in mine. Another study that I looked at followed counseling education students receiving a reflective journaling component to their coursework. And this group found that the groups of students receiving the reflective journaling component had personal as well as academic growth over the students who were not using that reflective journaling component. Moving on to the purpose of my study, students who do not have their reading difficulties addressed early on are at risk for being struggling readers for the rest of their lives. The demand for being a successful reader throughout their lives justifies the need to research and implement more effective reading interventions to catch these students before they become a dropout statistic. So here's an anonymous makeup of my class this year based on their beginning of the year inventory assessments. I have 20 students, 11 of whom were identified as at risk, the driving force behind my reading intervention study. Getting effective reading interventions and catching those students. So the purpose of my study was to determine if the addition of reflective journaling to pre-existing reading interventions generated greater growth in the students receiving the reflective journaling component versus the students who were receiving the pre-existing reading intervention as is without anything added onto it. The study focused on 3 components for growth: fluency, phonics, and comprehension. And then I combined all those scores to create an overall picture of their reading ability. So my research design. I used a quasi-experimental design, more specifically pre-test, post-test. So I tested my students individually at the beginning of my 6-week study in fluency, phonics, and comprehension, and we'll look at those assessments in just a second. I took formative assessments every week throughout, and then on the 6th week, I took a final assessment to calculate growth scores, to be able to calculate growth scores for my students over that 6-week span of time. The classroom size for this study consists of 20 students, 8 of whom are utilized in the study based on their at-risk needs, and then students who were given permission to participate. The group of students that I identified and used for my study include 4 boys and 4 girls, so it's evenly split. And among those students, 1 student receives speech services, and 2 of those students receive ESC or exceptional student services, or speech delays, language delays, and academic delays. This group of students is made up of Hispanic students, African American students, and Caucasian students. The intervention. Moving on to my intervention, both the control and treatment groups received a pre-existing reading intervention that I was already using in my classroom. The control group continued to receive the intervention as is with no changes, and my treatment group received the same intervention with the inclusion of reflective journaling before, during, and after the intervention block. So here is a sample of about midway through my study of one of my students' journals. I had them write a before section and I had them write an after section. Most of the reflective thinking happened out loud as a group. They are 6 and 7, so writing is not an easy process for them. So we did a lot of reflective conversation, and then I gave them sentence stems, as you can see, like last time we worked on, or today we worked on, and next time I will. So I gave them some sentence stems to get those reflective thoughts from their minds and their voices onto paper. And then I let them go, and I read it afterwards, and I was able to see areas that I wasn't intending to look on. So I can see some misspelled words that I need to maybe go back and hit again. My data was taken weekly using 3 separate assessments, 1 for phonics, 1 for fluency, and 1 for comprehension. Here is a sample phonics assessment. So students were scored of the amount of words they read correctly out of the total possible words to get a percentage score. This test took roughly 2 to 5 minutes per student, depending on how long it took them to sound out words. The next assessment that I took weekly was a fluency assessment. So this is a sample fluency passage, one that I used throughout the study. So the students were given a minute on a timer to read as many words as possible, and they were scored words correct per minute, and then I took that score and divided it out of the total number of words possible to get a percentage score. And then the last type of assessment I took was comprehension. So here's just a sample page out of one of their comprehension stories, and then I took a sample page of their questions. This test was given whole group to all of my students, and then for my study, for the purpose of my study, I only looked at the comprehension test. This test has several different components to it, but I only looked at the comprehension questions to derive a percentage score, number correct out of total possible. So here are my raw scores for comprehension. and again for phonics, and again for fluency. So the raw scores that you just saw were used to determine an overall growth rate for each category that I looked at and an overall picture. I took the mean score from those 3 phonics, fluency, and comprehension categories to create an overall picture. The growth rate was determined by taking 100 times their last score, their most recent score, minus their first score, the very beginning score, divided by the first score to get the percent change. And then to get the growth rate, I took the percent change that I found here and divided it by the number of weeks, which was 6. And that gave me a... So here are my growth rates. So you can see I've got my comprehension growth rate for each individual student, treatment group, control group. For phonics, I've got each individual student's growth rate. For fluency, I've got each individual student's growth rate. And then I took, for student A, I took first score plus second score plus the third score and divided it by 3 to get the mean or average score for that student to get an average growth rate for each student. And then the students, I took an average growth rate by adding the 4 scores from the 4 students in my treatment group and then dividing by 4 to get a mean score. And then I did the same with my control group. My treatment group received an average of 47.91% growth rate, and then my control group got an average of 30.63% growth rate. So after compiling those growth rates, the treatment group ended up with 17.28 point increase over the control group with their overall reading growth rate, when that average score, that mean score. So the treatment group showed a higher growth rate in every category except for fluency, and I'll show you that on a graph in just a second. So when I looked at their individual score for each individual component, my treatment group scored higher than my control group, except in the fluency category. And this slight increase in growth is encouraging for the use of reflective journaling with my reading interventions in my own practice. So here is that graph. So my treatment group and my control group. So here are the comprehension scores. As you can see, treatment group scored higher than my control group. My phonics scores, treatment group higher than my control group, and that's just their mean scores. My fluency group, my fluency scores in my treatment group were lower than in my control group. And then overall, so that overall mean or average score, my treatment group was higher than my control group. So the literature agrees that it is essential to catch these struggling readers with effective reading interventions at an early age to catch them before they reach that point of failure, to close that gap between them and their same aged peers. So according to the U.S. Department of Education, I'm coming back to this statistic again. According to the U.S. Department of Education, the Institute of Educational Sciences, and the National Center for Educational Statistics, students who are still poor readers by grade 3 are 4 times more likely to be high school dropouts. So for me as a first grade teacher, it is so important for me to catch them now. And then from a final study that I looked at, when students who have fallen behind receive those evidence-based reading interventions early enough to make a difference, they can develop average reading scores and abilities and catch up to their same aged peers. So it's not impossible, it's just very difficult for them to catch up. My next step, so my action plan moving forward, my next step will be to look at the same study over a long-term period of time. 6 weeks after the conclusion of my study, my students will take their mid-year assessment. So that beginning of the year assessment that I showed you, just that anonymous score earlier, they're going to take the mid-year point of that 6 weeks after the study concluded, which hasn't happened yet. So I'm going to continue my groups as they are until that point so that I can look at a more long-term effect of that reflective journaling with my intervention groups. And then moving forward, I also want to look at reflective journaling with my math intervention groups and small groups. And then following that, I'm going to look at reflective journaling in other aspects of my classroom instruction. And that's my references.